Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm again joined by Tim Patton. Today we will begin a multi-part discussion on why Christianity. Today's episode will deal with questions of knowledge and epistemology. So why don't you open up your concerns here, Tim?
Okay, so tonight I'd like to sort of hear my ideas. I give you a list of speakers and lecturers, of course, and hear what I say and so forth. The two questions I asked is, how can we know anything? And then continue bracketing that up, especially God or something like Christ. And also, plenty of people claim to know things, yet are atheists, so they reject Christ. And I gave you a little chart, if you could, I don't know if you put that up there yet, but so I think there's sort of like it breaks down like a decision tree on views on epistemology, and you know, uh, what you think you can know and so forth. So I'm first going to say why I'm defending agnosticism. I'm defending agnosticism for many reasons, but first of all, it's just sort of the way I think about the world, so forth. So I mean, it's sort of a two-step problem. If my uncertainty about the existence of God could be solved, then I might be. But there's plenty of room within Christianity, but that's another episode. I mean, they can range from double predestination to Calvinism to liberation theology, but there's plenty of room within Christianity of what is exactly Christianity. And also, Christianity has claims about the world which are huge. So Christianity has always interested me. I mean, I am very sympathetic towards Christianity. I visited Israel, for crying out loud, as an agnostic. I visited Vatican. I mean, I've traveled a fair amount, but I typically go to religious sites because I think they're interesting. I think they're interesting. But back to epistemology and so forth. So epistemology's question is basically how we know things. I think you'd probably agree with that. And then metaphysics would be something like what is there and what is it like. So they're very much related. So I gave you three versions of that in the links, and strong realism, which I would say is represented by something like Hans Hoppe or Ayn Rand, and many other people as well. And then something like minimum realism, which I gave you as some middle position, and then radical skepticism, which is something like Thaddeus Russell. And one thing that I think both Thaddeus Russell and Hans Hoppe would agree on, at least when it comes to knowledge itself, is that actually somewhat in agreement. Because I had this problem when I was when I was in college. I was doing international relations, sort of a useless major in some regards, but you pick up some random interesting tidbits. And a lot of social science is basically built on logical positivism, which is Karl Popper's domain, which is the domain of falsification and so forth. And in that lecture, Hans Hoppe really attacks this idea of falsification or verificationism and confirmationism as basically sort of crypto postmodernism or relativism. And actually, Thaddeus Russell would agree with that as well, in that because Thaddeus Russell's view on knowledge, he takes Hayek's view of knowledge, which is like that knowledge is created by man in humans' minds and so forth. And like Thaddeus Russell would say things like in that debate, that little hot mess of a podcast with Carlos. He would say things like he thinks dreams are more as real as the actual reality. But I think what links the logical positivists and the postmodernists is this radical skepticism. And actually, in an essay, Gary North of all people gave is I'll read what Gary North has to say about the logical positivists. And this is about economics, but I think a lot of the ideas of like how we know things are true regardless of domain. So Mises defended his epistemology or outcome because it's the outcome of deductive logic of human action coupled with free informed choices by rational self-interested people. Hayek defended on an inductivist basis. Nobody knows what is true because nothing can be said to be permanently true. So maybe the best ideas win. And that's what North would call the evolutionist defense of the market. But again, I think it's an evolutionist epistemology as well, which includes the logical positivists and includes the radical skeptics like the postmodernists like Foucault and so forth. So that's my overview, what I think of epistemology and so forth. And I gave that tree because you have different views, and you can still wind up at the similar conclusions. Because you can get people like Christian mystics who don't think we can know anything, yet still believe in God. And you can get like people like Hoppe and Rand who believe we can know things and probably hold views that aren't falsifiable, so to speak, yet also are atheists. And you get in between positions, so forth. So there's many different positions that you can get to, and I just sort of like to go there because I think Christianity, and I gave you the Nozick book, because I think Christianity has claims about how you should run your life. It's not merely like it's not merely some abstract philosophical position. So I think Christianity has to be like a convincing argument of like on regards to different versions of epistemology and why it's true and so forth. So I'll leave it up to you. I've said some things and hear what you have to say and so forth.
Well, yeah. Also, we have the spreadsheet up on the stream, so maybe you want to talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah. So I'll walk through it. So like the strong realists, like Hoppe and Rand, for example, they make fun of people like Kant. I mean, Rand's famous for hating Kant for this reason, but yet Rand is probably one of the biggest atheists out there. And then on the other hand, you get people, I'd argue, like Kierkegaard, who are and the late Wittgenstein, who are in some degrees, Wittgenstein I think died as a Catholic convert of some variety, who are like basically ultra postmodernists in their skepticism towards like knowledge and so forth and what we can know things, but end up as you know. And I also added the preference line because I think preferences matter too. Because I still agree with you with our first talk on Christianity that like without Christianity, without a kind of God, we have sort of meaningless car crash and so forth. And I agree with that, but that doesn't change the fact whether or not that God exists and how can we know it exists. So that's what I've made that chart for, because I think it's because I think there's different views on epistemology, and you get like a whole outcome of opinions, so forth. But that's what do you think?
Okay, so it looks like your sort of first statement is how can we know anything?
Yes.
Right, as opposed to nothing. Well, when it comes to the question of how do we know something, I think in some sense Descartes gives us a good starting point. Something that cannot not be doubted. So, for example, something like my existence, right? Even if I doubt the trustworthiness of my senses or doubt my own existence, I still have to presuppose something, i.e. that I exist, to even have that thought process. Or in a more general sense, what Aristotle calls the transcendental argument, where to affirm the truth is to deny a truth. So, for example, I'll give you two examples. The first example is the law of non-contradiction. If you were to assert that it's false, you would in fact be asserting the truth within the statement itself. Because if it is false, then it's not true that it's both false and true at the same time in the same sense. So it's true by definition. It cannot not be doubted. Another one will be Kant's notion of a priori synthetic statement or concept. We could say that if you were to say that a priori synthetic statements are false or not real, you have a problem, because is it a posteriori? Is there anything from our sense perception or experience that tells us this is not true? No, of course not. Is it analytic, like an a priori analytic, like the statement all bachelors are unmarried males? No, it is not. It's not analytic as well. So being not analytic nor a posteriori, it is the statement denying the truth of a priori synthetic statements is itself an a priori synthetic statement. Therefore, it's self-performatively absurd and must be true. Or rather, the contrary, must be true. So statements like those we can know with absolute certainty are true. And I think we can start from statements like that.
Okay. Well, see, this is where we're going to get more into it here. But what divides the difference between a priori statements and like empiricist type statements? Because one of our disagreements is over like Hoppe. And one of the reasons I like the Austrian methodology is they basically reject they reject empirical claims, and I think a lot of reject complete empirical claims. Like, I take minimum wage. Austrians don't think it can be tested, and that's one of the things I gave you in that praxeology lesson. So, do you think something like we can go out and test for God, test for evolution? I mean, I'm even skeptical if we can test for things like, um, um, whether democracies cause peace. Like, Hoppe is very skeptical about whether you can design tests to do these things. I mean, and this is where Walter Block agrees as well on this matter. And actually, some of the early logical positivists would actually argue that evolution wasn't falsified. Evolution is not really falsifiable because it's not testable. So, I mean, this has been
that was actually a claim Popper made.
Yeah. So some of the early, and actually Dawkins himself has sort of adopted the view that, at least this is according to John Gray, who's a very smart agnostic. I gave you, and this is he said, made it like a Monty Python type joke, but Dawkins said something like, philosophy is a form of religious fundamentalism, and John Gray said that to make fun of Dawkins, but a lot of scientific method. I mean, I just don't. There's a lot of assumptions in this. But what would you say? What divides a priori and empirical and so forth? And are things like big theses? Like, I could say I think of like the city of Philadelphia exists, because I've been there. But does the city of Singapore exist? I mean, I could go test if Singapore exists, but I've never visited there. I think it exists. I take it on authority, and so forth. Does Pluto, the planet or whatever entity called Pluto, exists? I don't know. Like, I mean, there's certain things that might be outside of, so to speak, testable phenomena. I think a lot of social science concepts are basically untestable as well. And that was actually one of the first reasons I found Hoppe, because Hoppe sort of explained the method of logical positivism the clearest. What do you say?
Well, I would say that the definition for the two statements, I think, explains the nature of the kinds of knowledge. A priori knowledge means knowledge prior to experience.
Prior to experience, yes.
And a posteriori knowledge means knowledge derived after experience. Now, I certainly understand the skepticism to a posteriori thinking that someone like you or Hoppe would have. In fact, I share a lot of it myself. Well, what ends up happening is we have a domain problem, right? Within the limits of the natural sciences, something that can be repeated within something like laboratory conditions. Empiricism is quite strong. That's what drove the scientific revolution and industrialization.
I agree. One second. I agree. Like, something like what material is the best to build the bridge, that I totally agree. You can test stones. That's I'm not doubting. That's not what I'm doubting, but keep going.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying you were. I'm just saying that's what ends up happening with any new idea that's extremely powerful in one limited domain. There's a temptation to apply it everywhere, as if it's universally applicable because it's so powerful in this one specific area. And I think this is where we begin to see problems, because human beings are, one, not like inanimate objects in that for every given situation, we're going to respond the same way, the same time. For example, like with a litmus test, if you control for all the variables, the chemicals will always react the way you predict. Human beings on an individual level can never do that, which is why, like in Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, psychohistory doesn't deal with predicting the actions of individuals. It deals with predicting the actions of groups, because groups, their actions can be predicted within limits, whereas an individual, it's almost impossible. And so when you apply to like social sciences, economics, then you have a problem. And you also have a problem when you apply to time, which is where you brought up, say, something like evolution or even history. These are things that are in time and in the past. So they're things that we can't see or observe, ergo it's not, it's not scientific in the narrow Baconian sense of where it actually works. And in those cases, I think that's where we begin to run into some serious problems of applying the method. Now, as far as, I would also make a distinction between a kind of loose a posteriori, which you might begin to trace with Aristotle. if you look at Aristotle's The Politics, as a political scientist, he's firmly a posteriori. He looks at city-states and kingdoms around him, past nations, and then tries to deduce or develop from those inferences some of the best modes of organizing a society, which is why in Book 4 of The Politics he concludes that a middle class is the ideal class in which to organize a city-state around. Because if you look at city-states run by the poor, city-states run by the rich, over a period of time, these city-states run by the middle class tend to have better outcomes. And this is where I think you can't have a test and control in a strict scientific laboratory sense with politics. But if we look at the Greek city-states, I think we can narrow the domain enough that we can have a weaker empiricism, where, yes, we know Spartans aren't Athenians and Corinthians aren't Thebans, fair enough, but they're all Greeks. They all share enough in common that if we control for their modes of governance within city-states, we can sort of get a generic, okay, which is better than the other? Because they have enough in common, Greekness, that from there we can then use it as a quasi-control. And then create, now again, those conclusions would be of a weaker strength than a conclusion based on a laboratory test. But nonetheless, I think that it's strong enough that it's not completely irrelevant. For example, the Founding Fathers were also political empiricists. And you compare their political system that they developed by analyzing Greece and Rome, Aristotle and Cicero, to, say, libertarianism or Marxism, or these more radical a priori political theories.
Like the people. See, the first things I found you was your argument against Casello. That was the first thing I heard about you. I thought that was a sort of heroic defense of a heroic. You really poked a lot of holes into NAP style Rothbardian, pure anarcho-capitalism, which is what you were attacking in that episode. So that's the first thing I found you. So that's what I agree with, but keep going.
Yeah. So what I would say is that if you look at within the past 250 years, probably the most successful revolutionary political experiment was that of the United States and the Founding Fathers. And I would argue they were the most successful of these revolutionary thinkers, in part because they were rooted in history and rooted in a kind of empirical political philosophy. As even Burke says in the Discourse Reflections on the French Revolution, that you can't have an a priori political theory. But the point is this, is that if you look at Marx, who does a priori, teleological history for the sake of political science, to some extent libertarians and certainly anarchists, none of them have had any real success in applying their political theories to reality. Whereas, for all of its faults, the American political experiment was the most successful of all the revolutionary experiments. And I think it was successful because it did pursue this kind of middling kind of empiricism, political empiricism, which does lead to developing improvements on political thought.
All right, well, I'm going to shift this back to more Christianity a little bit. But so when you think there is or isn't a God, do you think are you going to base it on an a priori concept, or are you going to do a mixture of the two and so forth? Because a lot of because one thing I like about people like there was an article about C.S. Lewis. It's on a blog post, but C.S. Lewis is one of the first as a postmodernist, and one of the things I agree that Thaddeus Russell and C.S. Lewis agree is people aren't just like, there's this parody of economics, the Homo economic man, the man that just calculates the utils up and so forth, right? So like people pick things for many reasons and so forth, not just purely on rationalistic reasons, which is what they're sort of parodying and so forth. And we have to sort of make a choice of Christianity. That's why I included preference at the bottom as well. So when you're basing your choice of theism or not, are you basing it on a priori display? Are you going to go out and just from first principles, like some sort of ontological type argument? Or are you going to go out and look for angels or demons, or, you're going to try to falsify evolution and so forth? What's your methodology for doing that? Because apologetics sometimes have a sort of shotgun approach where they just sort of take atheist arguments and shoot them down, but from starting points, what's your principle and so forth?
Yeah, I would argue that you'd have to start from a priori concepts, that God, while not purely being an abstraction, would be proven in a way similar to the way you'd prove mathematical proofs, or the way you'd prove geometric proofs, or even philosophical proofs. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell you a whole lot about that particular God. I mean, you can, from first principles, you can only get so far, so I wouldn't limit it to that. But I'd begin with first principles. And once we've established a certain set of facts about God, that then we'd move on to, okay, why Christianity? Because even amongst monotheism, we have Islam, Judaism, Deism, Baha'ism, and other forms. So I would then say, go ahead.
Zoroastrianism and so forth, right? Was that monotheism? Yeah. Yeah. So you don't think the claim whether or not there is a God is in some ways falsifiable, right? Because you get something like Kant's Antinomies, where he sort of deduces two contradictory claims. There isn't a first cause, there is a first cause, and so forth. Do you think it's open question that there isn't? Do you think that's an absurd type question to ask on my part?
I think it would be. And this is where I would agree with, say, someone like Hoppe, when he says, something is, if you raise the minimum wage, you're going to get more unemployment. I mean, all things being equal, there might be other factors that would change that outcome. But if you control for all things being equal, yeah, you're going to get more unemployment. And to say that it's not the case would seem to be a bit silly. But I would argue, though, that if there is the premise that there is no first cause is meaningless. It's like saying there's a square circle.
So I'm going to tackle a little bit. So this Hume's critique, which is what sort of causality, is what Nassim Taleb really ran with here, and is like, how do you know that A causes? I mean, first of all, you have to trace the link between cause and effect, so forth, and then how do you know to what degree somewhat thing they're related? I mean, I think they divide it into four causes, like the efficient. Aristotle does this. I think it's the efficient, the first, and so forth. A priori theism seems a little abstract. I just have a sort of problem with it. But what do you think?
Okay, so I'm guessing there's two questions here, right? How do you trust your inferences? And then the other one is, well, as to your second question, though, is a priori enough? I would say no, a priori alone isn't enough. But what I would use an a priori proof for God's existence as a starting place, as to lay a foundation. Because, I mean, you're not going to abstract from first principles that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and is the Son of God. I mean, exactly. that's not something you're going to abstract from first principles. And to some extent, I think some of the atheist objections to arguments by like William Lane Craig are that, hey, well, the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't prove that Christ rose from the dead. But I think that's a misunderstanding of what Craig is trying to do. He's first trying to establish that there is a omnipotent personal being that broadly meets the omni faculties of God as described in the Bible. So postulating such a being exists is reasonable. That's the first step. Then the next step is to say, okay, well, why should we believe this being is the being described in the Bible? And that would be a whole separate set of issues revolving around the reliability of the testimony of Scripture, primarily in the case of Christianity, the four Gospels, and to a lesser extent, say, the book of Acts, because it does add to the veracity of the. There's the parable where Christ said, right, if you're faithful in a little things, you'll be entrusted with large things. So the general idea would be is if you could prove the Bible is factually correct on a whole host of these issues that may seem mundane or trivial, it will then raise the overall probability that the more unbelievable claims are accurate and true. And so that would be a combination of factors: textual criticism, historical observation, or not observation, historical records and whatnot. So I would use a holistic approach where you would use both empirical and a priori methods as appropriate for the question at hand. So for something like does God exist, that's just is not an empirical question. It's a category mistake. It's like when you're doing a domain and a function, right? If it's outside the domain, it just doesn't fit. It's the wrong kind of thing you're looking for. Your function isn't going to solve that problem. And so it's outside the domain of this question. So, I don't see God under you wouldn't say, well, does the sum interior angle of a triangle add up to 180 degrees? You wouldn't go around with microscopes and measuring sticks to see, if the triangleness matches that. And you say, well, I didn't see a triangleness anywhere. I guess triangles don't exist. No, that's goofy. That's silly. Nobody would do that.
See, this is where I still remain somewhat of a skeptic in this regard, because this is where Taleb got his idea and Hume got his idea. It's Hume's problem and Taleb's problem are basically identical, but there used to be a saying: you sooner see, and this was sort of like going around with the triangles. You'd sooner see pigs fly than you'd see a black swan. And lo and behold, when European discoverers found, whatever parlance you want to use, piss off some of the progressives for saying that, Australia, they would say, now we found a black swan. So that's an example of, you say all swans are white. A swan is a white bird. You'd sooner see pigs fly, and now we found a black swan. And that's sort of the root of inferring from generalizing from a small sample. So like in a lot of these, I've watched like the Stephen Meyer creation versus intelligent evolution versus creation debate. And I think at the heart of evolutionary thinking is the idea that they sort of base their thinking on the world has no cause. It's just sort of this, you get this sort of law of eternal return and so forth. I mean, you get parodies of this and so forth, but I agree with Popper that evolution was never necessarily falsifiable, but Popper also thinks, in some ways, Popper thinks nothing is true in some regards, as Gary North points out. Like, if everything's false. So I just have a lot of problems with inferring a priori and a priori. So I think the theist has a tall task. Would you agree?
Well, I would argue that the theist has no taller a task than anyone else. Proving that the universe came about due to the direct guidance of an omnipotent being is no less of a task than proving that the universe came about from no cause at all, for no reason at all, on purely material processes.
I guess.
I mean, why is one intuitively more implausible than the other? For mmany people, the latter account is extremely implausible. And so I think that we have no more of a burden than anyone else. Mm-hmm. Because what we're talking about is the scope of the problem is creation and existence itself. And everybody has to give an account of it. And that's a very big and abstract and difficult question to answer. So I think that everybody has an equally hard time of answering it. It's just that due to certain prejudices that we have, we think some are intuitively more plausible than others.
I gave you one of the I gave you I think one of the R.C. Sproul ones, and one of the things I like is whether or not people are actually pluralistic is some question. But one thing I like about pluralism, and this goes back to the essay that Popper wrote on the open society, where a free society is a society that has no permanent truths. One of the problems I have with
but real quick, isn't that a permanent truth?
Yeah, exactly. So there's some regard that you can't have the very claim that they're claiming. But don't you think it's better to have, for both aesthetic reasons and liberty-based reasons, more of an open frame? I mean, I don't think the atheists are very tolerant, first of all. But it's not clear that the theists were maybe the theists were more tolerant than the atheists, depending on who you include an atheist and who you include a theist, some of the categorizing problem and so forth. But like, I like the sort of, postmodern outlook in some ways. Like, libertarians have recently, I think Michel Foucault is going to get the same treatment that Nietzsche got. And that's going to be picked up by a lot of right wingers, especially in the future. But Michel Foucault wrote a book called The Birth of a Clinic, and it's just sort of like a political. Anthropologists have been doing this for years. Anthropologists go to like places. You get things like the cargo cult and things. You go study religion as like a phenomena rather than that. And Michel Foucault just did that to medicine. And actually, Reason Magazine recently picked up as an argument against centralized healthcare and so forth. So there's a lot of like mystic style arguments like that, like anti-realist type arguments that get you closer to theism. But as Sproul and others point out, theism itself is a truth claim, and also as Popper's claim is a truth claim as well. So you have to sort of pick. But for liberty-based reasons, do you think it's better to be an open society in that way, or do you think that question can't be answered? Should be answered in the affirmative. There is a God, but all.
So are you saying that it is for liberty-based reasons? Is it better to be more a priori, like say Hoppe or Christian theists, or a posteriori, like the empiricists and postmodernists? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that it's better to begin from first principles and a priori, because if you look at the history of the very idea of Western liberty, which is rooted in the twin foundations of the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek philosophers, both believed firmly that truth could be known and that truth is accessible to human reason. And then initially in independent paths, and then later with their convergence in Christianity, the political thought of freedom as we know it today developed from that assumption. And we could also look, again, correlation does not imply causation, but it does lead to some interesting thoughts, is as what we might call irrationalism is on the rise, so is state power. State power has been steadily growing since in the United States and in Europe since the 1930s. So, for example, from the maybe even since World War I. Because if you look at a lot of libertarian historiography, they say that the liberal age, from the late 18th to the early 20th century, we had, a more liberalizing society where the government became less intrusive, less authoritarian, and less of a problem. And then, World War I, it's sort of a shock to the system, but it's really in the Great Depression, the 30s, and World War II, where in Europe and the United, specifically in the Anglosphere, where the government explodes. And it's also, I don't think, a coincidence that it's also at that time that ideas like post-structuralism, the sort of Vienna school, all start to become extremely influential amongst the elites. And I remember I sent you that link from Ends and Means, that segment from Ends and Means by Aldous Huxley. They embraced the principle of meaninglessness primarily because it did liberate them from responsibilities. And so he mentioned specifically, and this is what would be relevant to liberty in the sense in which libertarians speak of it, is economic liberty. He said that we felt that the economic system, i.e. capitalism, was illegitimate. So we embraced meaninglessness in order to overthrow and reject capitalism or a private property-based society. And so he makes the direct connection between this principle of meaninglessness that this kind of open epistemology leads to and the rise of socialism.
So you think in this way, Karl Popper, in that regard, because you seem more sympathetic to people like Hayek than you are to Mises in this regard. You think people like Karl Popper is false then, like the school of logical positivism is basically false, like the radical.
Oh, it is, and it was admitted as such by A.J. Ayres. A.J. Ayres, famously in the '60s. There was a certain philosophical TV show, I think it was a British show, and he interviewed these leading philosophers, and one of them was A.J. Ayres, and he asked A.J. Ayres, what's the problem with logical positivism? And he's like, well, pretty much that none of it's true. And this is A.J. Ayers, who wrote in 1936 the sort of like flagship Bible of logical positivism.
Do you think Dawkins is a logical positivist? I actually don't think he is. I think his first principle is a kind of naturalism, but Dawkins has dismissed philosophy just because you can make theists like William Lane Craig can make sort of tricky, not I shouldn't use tricky, they make arguments like that and so forth, and sort of attacks the atheist. Do you think Dawkins is a logical positivist? What would you say about Dawkins?
Well, to answer that, I think it was probably better answered by Christopher Hitchens. There was a debate. I think he was in it with William Lane Craig, and there was a Q&A session of the debate, and I think somebody asked Hitchens, are you a moral realist? And he's like, well, it depends on what day you ask me. Some days, I don't think there's any moral reality at all, but on other days I'm, moral righteousness, anger against, this or that institution or God. And I think Dawkins is schizophrenic like that too, like Hitchens. It'll waffle from one moment to the next, because I think in part the problem and inner contradiction here is pointed out beautifully by some of those quotes in the Nozick book from Hume in the chapter you had me read on skepticism.
Oh yeah, that's a great chapter. Yeah,
where Hume is like, yeah, this once you dine with your friends and experience the outdoors, all of this just feels like meaningless. And I think to some extent he's right, at least in that more candid moment, because I've never met a skeptic that actually lives as if every single data point he ever consumed was run through this rigorous autistic skepticism meter. I mean, one of my favorite examples is Ravi Zacharias told a story about a Hindu philosopher who said that all was illusion. That's the great Hindu idea that all is illusion with moksha. And the king sent an elephant from his stables to chase the philosopher, and he ran up a tree. And the king sits there mocking, saying, I thought this reality was an illusion. And the philosopher said, you saw an illusionary elephant chase an illusionary me up an illusionary tree.
So, but I want to push a little bit on this. Do you think there's concepts like Donald Rumsfeld a few years ago got back in the lead up to the Iraq War, got laughed at it, but I think it's actually a bit of profundity. Whether or not he stole it from, he probably did. But do you think there are things we know that we don't know, like?
There were the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, right?
Yeah.
I actually think he's right. That seems to cover all the possibilities. Now, of course, the unknown unknowns we won't know because they're unknown
unknowns. Exactly. Do you think so? So back to the question: is there a God? Are you 100% certain there was one? 99 point. If you could design like some sort of like probability of this, I think see Pascal in my way was the first person with that table that designed a sort of prediction market for whether or not there is a God. Would you be absolutely certain there is, or do you hold out any uncertainty in regards to the question? Do you think there is a case for uncertainty regarding the question and so forth?
Yeah, well, as regards to the existence of God, no, I don't have any doubt, for the reason that God is like, again, in this loose sense, is like a geometric or a philosophical proof. To deny, to say something like the sum interior of a triangle are greater or lesser than 180 degrees, we know it's intuitively false. It just follows from the relationship we've stated, or the idea that the law of the excluded middle is not real. No, we know it's real. It's we don't have to prove it, and we know it with certainty, and that's how we then deduce other things. Now, without getting into all the arguments for the existence of God, I believe that God is known in much the same way.
So you think you're 100% certain of a sort of deism, right? That there is some sort of deity out there, right?
Deism can, I think, be demonstrated 100%.
Interesting. As far as more here, as sort of more so to speak, domestic front in terms of knowledge, do you think there is? Do you think having a sort of relativist view in some domains is necessary, and actually, in this regard, better at finding? Because there are views out there that are probably false, that we don't know if they're false, that they're falsely linked things. So take like the issue of climate change. People. This is that's maybe a too of a hot button, so to speak, issue. But there's certain times people claim X causes Y, and everyone, it's like a census, or this causes that, and people will make an empirical case in that regard. Is having a more because it's funny. I was reading a lot of the climate change skeptics, and they're implying sort of these. As Thaddeus Russell actually interviewed a climate change skeptic. He was pretty good on this, and it was funny because Thaddeus Russell was giving him kind of a radical skepticism. Be skeptical of universities. Be skeptical of powerful people. Be skeptical of science and so forth. So I just had a laugh at the interview. He interviewed, I forget who it was, but what do you think about that? Because I think there is a case in certain domains where it's very good to have an extremely open degree of mind. What do you think?
I would tend to agree, but I think there needs to be an important distinction made. Skepticism as a philosophical, epistemological method, like Pyrrhonianism or Humeanism, I think is bunk for the reasons that we've discussed.
Mm-hmm.
But skepticism in a looser sense. So, for example, obviously, if a certain authority figure tells you something is true, and it's in his best interest that it be true, yeah, you might want to take that with a grain of salt, because if he tells you something, so right, this is where we get from history the evidence from embarrassment, which is why even like certain statements in the Bible are believed to be true by even like agnostics like Bart Ehrman, because of the embarrassment evidence, right? They would have no reason to tell you this is true because it doesn't help them. And so in that sense, that would be a skepticism reducer, right? But if it was in their just because something is in your self-interest to be true and you say it's true doesn't mean it's false. It might very well be true, and it very well be in your self-interest that it be true. But I could understand why somebody might say, okay, I'm going to have a little bit of a higher standard of evidence for this, because this person would benefit a lot if it were true. So there's that. Also, if somebody's prone to be irresponsible and not true before, like they have a track record of telling tall tales or saying things that you already know to be false. If they tell you something else, well, okay, yeah, you might think of like the boy who cried wolf. The third time he might be telling the truth. It's funny, right? He might be telling the truth, but according to sort of the dilemmas we have, it would be rational to assume he's not, given his prior experience. So, but I would say that, yeah, in certain contexts, a healthy dose of skepticism is probably a good idea, but not a sort of thoroughgoing epistemological skepticism. Skepticism not of method necessarily, the method of knowledge, but maybe skepticism of the claim being made, if that makes sense.
What? Wait. So you were you always 100% certain on it? And do you think it? So I make fun of the and so does John Gray. I think these sort of arguments, like since you were born in a Christian society, therefore you're a Christian. I mean, that's as true as for since you're born in a Marxist society, you might be a Marxist, so forth.
But wait. According to atheists, since babies are atheists, the fact that you were born a baby means you were born an atheist. So the fact that you're an atheist doesn't mean anything.
Exactly. So were you always this way? Did you ever, so to speak, lapse into skepticism or so forth? Are there days where you're like Christopher Hitchens, where you're not as certain and so forth? Do you have a chronic, do you have a consistent certainty about it, because there's things I'm more certain about, and there's things I'm less certain, so to speak, about. I'm pretty certain my hand exists, right? I don't see that, but whether or not, I don't know, some far off planet exists, I'd have no clue, and I actually have no interest in knowing that either. But also Christianity has very relevant claims about like you, what's going to happen to you, so forth. So there's also claims in there. So were you always 100% certain? Is this just something you came to later in life and so forth? What's your...
Well, I would say I was always, I guess when I was younger, there were times when I wondered if there was a God, but we're talking like middle school or high school, and I hadn't really studied philosophy yet, so I didn't know how you demonstrate that such a being existed, and so the lack of knowledge at the point it's what Bacon said: a little bit of philosophy inclineth a man to atheism, but a lot of philosophy inclineth a man to God. Once you know the arguments, once you know the landscape of ontology, then belief in God becomes progressively easier and more certain.
The one piece I gave you, do you actually buy into Rand's interpretation of Kant? Because it seems to be that Sproul actually, in some way, does regard it. Because you get you push it back to the idea that it's dumb not to believe in God, which is probably true at some point. It was the intellectual climate was dumb. I mean, universities, of course, were started by some version of theists and so forth. So, do you think that what I think is called the classical synthesis will come back or so forth? And do you think having the classical synthesis is a benefit, so to speak? What would you say?
Well, I guess to the first question, no, I don't think Ayn Rand got Kant right. I think a lot of people get Kant wrong. I think the general rule of thumb is if you want to hear someone's philosophy, it's best to hear it from their own mouth, or short of that, from one of their disciples' mouths, because at least their disciple is going to be more interested in fairly and accurately describing their position than Ayn Rand. And in fact, I think Ayn Rand got most things wrong outside of her specialty. When she's talking about other people's philosophies, she could describe her own philosophy accurately to other people. That's not in contest. But describing other people's philosophies accurately to their own satisfaction, probably not. Now, as to the second question, the classical synthesis, presumably you mean the sort of synthesis of sort of classical reason and Christian principles, as we saw in the early universities. Yep. Definitely. I think that is desirable, and also quite likely to come back. For demographic reasons, the skeptics just don't have kids, and eventually, the demographic wheels will turn, and religious people, Christians, Muslims, will be the predominant demographic.
Huh. So you think that's going to come back? What do you make about this? Is an argument for a kind of atheism that has always sort of stuck in my mind. And you sort of get this with Hayek, with religion and the guardians of traditions. You have like a lot of different religions competing in a market, so to speak. And Christianity, it's not that Christianity Christianity emerged because it had I'm not necessarily saying I have this argument. I want to hear what you hear about it. Christianity emerged. There was lots of competing religions at the time, and Christianity just happened to emerge because it had the right. It had the mix to make people, it's the mix to make. I don't know. It's hard to paraphrase an argument that you don't necessarily agree with necessarily. But yeah, something like, there was other religions, and Christianity will die out, and a new religion will come in place, and so forth. I mean, it implies a kind of naturalism in the background.
So basically, what you're trying to say is that, what do I think of the proposition that Christianity was just the most competitive religion of the first century at meeting people's felt spiritual needs, as opposed to, say, Mithraism or the old gods,
and therefore they had more children, and therefore they came to in some way conquer a large portion of the world, and same way with Islam. Islam emerged, I think.
So you're saying that that's an argument against the truth of the claim. I
think it. I sort of agree with the anthropologists that say that there's no such thing as, and C.S. Lewis on this ground, there's no such thing as an atheistic society. And Jonathan Haidt would say the same thing as well, that all societies, you can't have like some sort of, they all have something called quote unquote religion. Um, does that haunt you in the background? The fact that there are, that does that cross your mind at all, and so forth? Um,
Well, I mean, I'm not an atheist,
True.
I'm not sure what the question you're asking is. I mean, for an atheist, if every society has been religious, then yeah, that should give you some pause. But I'm not an atheist, so that's actually comforting that all that there's a sensus divinitatis in man, which at least means that if we disagree over the divine itself, at least we all have this shared sense that there is something that should be called divine.
All right.
But I think what you're getting at earlier is sort of a naturalistic. I think what you were getting at earlier was what would I think of a naturalistic explanation of Christianity, in order that argument being made in order to sort of undermine, however subtly or not so subtly, the truth of the religion itself. Was that sort of what you were getting at in the earlier question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say even if true, it's irrelevant because that's the genetic fallacy.
And explain that.
The genetic fallacy is claiming that X is false because we've explained the origin of X. So we might say, for example, one of the things that's come about is there's been some research into the history of Nazi Germany. And so, for example, Hitler and the Nazis tended to be, quote, green. And so somebody might say, oh, yeah, a lot of this like environmental claptrap came from the Nazis, therefore it's false. Well, that would be the genetic fallacy. Whether those environmental beliefs or political, laws are true or not, they're true or not independently of their origin.
Do you think? I think I think there was a book called "Did the Greeks Believe Their Gods?" Do you think people believe in their gods? I mean, I think you do. Do you think the Greeks believed in their god as and so forth? I mean, they had a very complex system of gods. They had like thousands of them and so forth in different sites. Is it so? You said, do you think it's a matter of belief or knowledge, so forth? And is this sort of naturalism? Do you think how do you view naturalism and naturalists, so to speak, as people from a religious perspective and so forth? I'll ask those three questions. The third one might be a little convoluted, but
yeah. Okay. So did they believe in the gods? From the historical record, let's limit to the Greeks and the Romans, and let's even the Norse, because that's the three great Western polytheist traditions. I see no reason to believe they did not, because all of their written accounts indicate that they did. Even highly intelligent people like Plato, if you read, his dialogues, specifically the dialogues surrounding his trial and death and execution, he does believe. In fact, what does he say? He says, "I was given a mission by Apollo to do this." So I don't think there's no reason to believe that he is just saying that because he's a secret atheist and he's trying to placate the Athenians. That seems to be what some neocon philosophers want to believe. But no, there's if I tell you that I had a chicken sandwich today, and I actually, I have no reason to lie to you, you wouldn't assume that I'm lying to you or meaning it metaphorically, like I wish I'd had a chicken sandwich today. In the same way that when some on the alt-right might treat the old gods as Jungian archetypes. There are some that do that, but that I think is more the result of being in a post-Christian secular age. I think the actual Norse would not have done that. They would have believed, in fact, many of the gods were men. They became deified. Think of like Hercules, right? He was a man, and then he became a god. And so they could say, hey, yeah, I'm descendant from one of the gods. That was some of the claims made by emperors and things like that. So I believe that from all the evidence that they've given us, that they firmly did believe in that. That was what was the second question?
how do you see naturalists from a theistic perspective?
Okay. I'm going to refer briefly back to the John Gray video you had me watch.
Mm-hmm.
In the second part, I view those people much the same way as Gray views the teleological rationalists. When he talks about like the genetically engineered star child or the guy that rode back from the afterlife, these are not stupid people, as he points out in his lecture, but they believe some really goofy things, and I think the naturalists are like them.
Oh, what did you think of the Gray piece? I like Gray a lot.
It was really really good. I would recommend it to anyone. It's a very thoughtful and engaging discussion on the topic.
Yeah, Gray's book, The Immortalization Commission, Gray is like Gray's actually in the same way like you pointed out the first talk is sort of like it's sort of like fools for who was the guy that wrote that in the first talk, fools for Christ, and they put Nietzsche in there. Gray might be maybe not a fool, but Gray might be in that category because Gray is read by a lot of and highly liked by a lot of religious people, so to speak.
Oh yeah, Yaroslav Pelikan, that was the author of the book.
Yeah, so Gray is read by a lot of religious people, and they all tend to agree because what I think what Gray said in that lecture was that much of atheism is an attempt to escape a godless world, which is like that's seemingly a contradiction in terms, but there is a kind of romanticism that I think that naturalists have because they tend to create these other schemes like Marxism or like trying that Ray Kurzweil try to live forever. Ray Kurzweil, that's a sort of interesting guy to look up. He takes like 20 pills a day or something like that. So you were never an agnostic or a skeptic at all in your life. You'd say you were always firmly in the theistic camp, and then why?
I was always firmly in the theistic camp. Well, I mean, I would say probably for the first half of my life because that was what I was raised as. I think there needs to be made a distinction between, well, actually, three distinctions, right? You believe something to be true because that's all you know. So, right, as you grow up in a society, you initially grow up in a household, and most parents, if they're not terrible people, try to teach the children what they believe to be true. And then the second step is, coming to terms with, the other people believe this to be true. And generally people tend to associate with like-minded people. So then you're like, oh, well, they believe it to be true. But then you get to the point when, other people who don't believe it to be true. Like, oh, okay, well, what do you do with them? And then I guess the fourth thing would be, do you believe it to be true yourself? Like, have you internalized it? That's not necessarily the same thing, though it would include being able to prove it in some sort of, by looking at the evidence. So I'd say for the first half, probably because I was raised that way. And then the second half, having looked at the evidence for and against, I chose in favor of for. And since then, especially within the generic deism, I would say 100%. Now, that needs to be stated as distinct from the truths of the Christian religion. The truths of the Christian religion would be more historically contextual. In fact, they are very historically contextual. And so I'm very confident that they're true, but I wouldn't say I wouldn't say that I could prove they're true with the probability of 1 and in a way I could do it with a philosophical or a mathematical statement.
Fair enough. Back to Gray for a second. What was it? Second part of the Gray Q&A. Second part of the Gray Q&A. He asked, sorry. Never mind. I can't think of just escaped my mind. One of the problems I have with these arguments is they're 10 to 1 by the person who has the burden of proof. So if you, and this is somewhat true of libertarianism type arguments as well, that if you see in your debate with Kinsella, you referenced the debate between Christopher Hitchens and William Lane Craig. In it, Christopher Hitchens didn't have to overthrow the idea of God. He just poked a bunch of holes in the argument and so forth. And also, in your debate with Kinsella over is the NAP true, you just punched a bunch of holes in the argument. Do you think that most apologetics do more of the punching holes in thing, or creating a whole framework, then going out and defending that from attack, so to speak, using attack metaphor?
Yeah. Let me add a little bit of context to that statement about Kinsella. The Kinsella had mentioned to me in the debate. Well, he says, "Well, okay, well, what is your alternative?" And my point is like, look, to prove that Y is false, I do not have to prove that X is true. I only have to prove that Y is false. Then, since that was the scope of the debate, I did not need to prove, which is why I brought up Hitchens. To prove that God does not exist, one does not have to also prove that something else is true. That might be a logical question to ask next, but in order to win or defeat the proposition of the debate, you don't need to do that. The second thing is, as far as the burden of proof goes, everybody has a burden of proof because everybody's making claims. If so, the atheist or the agnostic will say, well, you claim that God exists, so you have a burden of proof, which is true, but they claim that God does not exist. Or more weakly, they claim that there is not sufficient evidence that God exists. Well, that's a claim. Prove there isn't sufficient evidence that God exists. So really, anybody that's making a claim has a burden of proof. Now, not all burden of proofs are equally burdensome. But then lastly, yeah, I could see why people would think that a lot of Christian apologetics tends to be poking holes apologetics. And to some extent, there's a lot of that. Now, that's not to say necessarily that it's wrong, because in some extent, you do need to, have some creative destruction, as Schumpeter would say. But on the other hand, though, the next question that everybody's going to ask is, well, then what next? What is the next step? And I think that's where you could say there has been a weakness. I mean, even someone as talented as a William Lane Craig or a Plantinga, we don't really see a systematic theology like what we would read in Calvin's Institutes or Aquinas' Summa Theologica. So it's like, okay, this is what we believe. This is what we say about God and creation and man and God, and it's all spelled out. Now, maybe they're not trying to do that for whatever reason, and okay, that's the scope they've limited themselves to. But I think, yeah, there is more probably poking holes than building a system. Go ahead.
See, my first question was I'm agnostic for two reasons. And first of all, some skepticism. And second of all, uncertain about, what exactly is the claims of Christianity and so forth. Because I think those, if you get past the first type a priori questions, then the second order questions, you have to sort of make debates within, and then it becomes a huge range of decisions within the framework of Christianity, or more broadly, theism, so to speak. So I'll just ask you as a side question, just for interesting point. So you think Zoroastrianism, if you give me like a one sentence thing of why you think these are false, Zoroastrianism, Shintoism, Islam. I'm not asking this in like a socialist justice warriors, like what about so forth and so forth. I just want to ask you like a one sentence, do you think the claims of those things are false? Is that correct, if I would say?
Yeah, yeah.
You think all those, you would say those are false? And then why? Have you looked? I'm not trying to ask this in this sort of like I got you type,
like a new atheist way. Have you read all the holy books?
Yeah, I'm not trying to ask you in that way, but
okay. Well, let me put it this way. Broadly speaking, I think we can speak of three historically accepted human views that have been accepted of the nature of reality: pure naturalism, some form of pantheism. I guess you could say four now: polytheism, and then monotheism. Right, so we got naturalism, polytheism, monotheism, and pantheism. Those are broadly speaking the four meta positions. So I would reject naturalism, which says all is matter, and whereas Pantheism says all is mind or all is spirit. I would argue that both are false with the same proof. The proof of the mind and the brain not being identical, using Leibniz's law of identity, because that proves that there is both a material and a spiritual component to the mind and the brain a priori. So they're both false, and I would just rule them out both out of the gate, because they both fail to meet this. Because the law of identity is the first, I think, of the logical trinity, right? The law of identity, the law of the excluded middle, the law of non-contradiction. And so, since they both fail at the law of identity, if applied through the application of Leibniz's law of identity, which is a further derivation from that principle, they're not true. So right out of the gate, anything else that they say isn't going to be interesting to me in a sort of truth-apt sense, because they've already believed in something that's fundamentally false. Now then, the next question will be, why not polytheism? Well, I'd argue that polytheism doesn't deserve to be considered, because God is not a creature that begins to exist in time. So, right, like you look at like the Theogony by I can't remember his name now. That was the one Greek poet. He's along with Homer, gives us the account of the gods. They're all creatures. They're all begin in time. Whereas God, as conceived of in the monotheist tradition, is a being that is well, for example, the contingency argument. That's what I'll use for this. Polytheistic gods are contingent beings, and therefore are not true God candidates, because God is the first mover, the non-contingent thing that gives rise to all contingent things. Again, going back to Leibniz, a thing either has an explanation external to itself or within itself. Polytheistic gods have explanations external to themselves, therefore they don't really explain much, because then where do these guys come from? So they only feed into the infinite regress. You have to have a God who is explained by his own essence. So that's why I would reject polytheist religions. Now, then narrowing it down to monotheist religions, Islam, Christianity, and the like, I would reject deism. Well, first of all, I reject all of those because I believe that the truth claims of Christianity are accurate. So when it comes to Christ, they all make certain claims. The Jews, the Muslims, the deists. The deists, he's a good teacher. The Muslim, he's a Muslim prophet. The Jews, he was a false prophet, unless they're like, some sort of messianic Jew. And then I don't know what Baha'i, I think Baha'i views Christ as just another prophet too. So they all make claims about the historical Jesus, if you want to use that term. And I believe that the historical Jesus does not fit any of those explanations. And that Christianity, among the monotheistic religions, gives the best explanation for the historical Jesus.
Fair enough. Why do you want Christianity to be true? Because I put the preference, and do you think it's somewhat silly for people to want the contrary? I mean, one of the reasons oftentimes I think Christians can get carried away when this is that people want Christianity to be true, and as you bring this up with the Huxley thing, because they want a nihilistic world. Why don't you want a nihilistic world, and why do you want Christianity to be true? And do you think Christianity actually answers the challenge of nihilism and meaninglessness as a thing itself?
Well, I guess I'll say I would want Christianity to be true as much as the atheists would want the non-existence of God to be true, because they have a set of invested interests in not. I mean, Christopher Hitchens, I think, probably most articulately expressed the atheist concern. He says that if God were real, it would be terrifying and terrible, because it'd be a celestial North Korea. I do find it interesting, though, that when Christopher Hitchens tries to describe how terrible God would be, he has to point to an atheist dictatorship, which I think the irony is lost on Hitchens. But I would say, okay.
Well, I would say that John Gray, for example, and then this might go back into some sort of no true Scotsman fallacy, but John Gray wouldn't call. John Gray views Bolshevism as a sort of, in his book Moral Relation Commission, as a sort of secular religion. So in some ways, now you might call that a no true Scotsman, but
well, no, I would actually agree Bolshevism is a secular religion, but by the same token, so is Hitchens's neocon, Jeffersonian, utopian liberalism. Which I think John Gray would agree with me on that assessment.
That's probably true.
But the question here is that as distinct from why I believe Christianity to be true, why would I want it to be true? And I think that question in answering is in much in alignment with answering your final question, because it does answer the question of nihilism. William Lane Craig, I don't remember the name of the essay, but he had a really good essay. I think it was called The Meaninglessness of Life Without God. And he goes through various examples, and he talks about, hell is other people from Sartre, the Camus, the last question of philosophy is suicide. Eventually what ends up happening is life just becomes meaningless. In fact, I think John Gray brings that up in his discussion with the Anglican priest. Doesn't he in the second part say, if we just continued living and living and living forever,
it'd be a nightmare.
It'd be a nightmare. Exactly. And so what makes it a nightmare is the fact, in part, that there's nothing else to be done. Right? Because I think the question was, the context for that was, why would a god fall in love with a human? Well, because there's certain limitations on humans that make life meaningful, but also horrifying. And it's avoiding that horrifying, because with God being infinite, the infinite, there's always something to do, something to learn, and there's something that is meaningful, right? It's not nausea.
Fair enough. Do you think there are, as far as within Christianity, do you think there is a such thing as a kind of atheist Christianity, so to speak, or it's just where the Christianity has long? We might have talked about this, and this is actually, I think, one of the claims that certain reactionaries will sometimes make as well. Do you think there is a kind of atheistic Christianity, or do you think there's a kind of atheistic Christianity which is more reliant on science? Because you get into debates. I've watched it. I'm not super up on it, but I've watched maybe one Young Earth versus Old Earth, and the Young Earth, people will like to say that they're too much bought into the culture and so forth. Do you think you can get almost all the benefits that a Hitchens gets within Christianity, so to speak, within the Christian positions and so forth?
Well, as to the first question, are there, quote, Christian atheists, which I assume you mean atheists who consciously or unconsciously still believe many Christian principles that they really can't give an account for on their own model? Yeah, I think there are a lot of those people. In fact, Max Stirner in The Ego in His Own describes them as the pious atheists. He calls it clericalism. They still have not fully shed off their Christian heritage. And to some extent, I think Nietzsche points this out too in some of his works as well. So I would tend to agree with that. And then there's that, and then the second question is that famous enthymeme by Christopher Hitchens. Name me any sort of good that religion provides that could not be alternatively provided by secular atheism. So, like, for example, he'd say, well, yeah, it may be the case that Christians invented hospitals, but secular people can run hospitals just as well, if not better, than Christians. So why do we really need them now? Well, it's simple. Replaceable birth rates. That's the one thing that we offer that they don't have. Being able to have replaceable birth rates so your society doesn't die out in a generation or two.
Fair enough. Who's the most intelligent atheist or agnostic out there of the bunch? First, we'll start with the new atheists, and then we'll move further away. But first, the so to speak, the four horsemen, so to speak.
Certainly Dawkins is the dumbest. I think Dawkins is the dumb one. Hitchens is the funny one. Harris is the stuck-up one. And if I had to say intelligent, Dennett was probably, and this is only in a relative sense, Dennett's probably the most intelligent of the bunch.
I think, how about of the 18th century, the big ones? Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, I think there's a fourth one. Of those three, which would you say?
Nietzsche, obviously. And I'd also add to that list Max Stirner. The reason why I put Nietzsche and Stirner is because they understand what you're giving up when you become an atheist. People like Freud and Marx and even Feuerbach, they're still trying to keep meaning when they can't. See, they're fleeing from the abyss with their own secular theology, just
as John Gray points out. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so at least Nietzsche and Stirner are more honest, if not more consistent. At least they're more honest than their opponents. And which is, of course, why Nietzsche got a place in Fools for Christ, because he understood what was being given up. But I think I'll preempt you here for the 20th century and 21st centuries. I did not know about John Gray until now, so I'm going to add him to the list as well.
Absolutely.
But I would have included Quentin Smith, the late Richard Gale, and Graham Oppie. Those are probably the three most intelligent atheists that I would have pointed to, and then of course now that I've come across Gray, I would add him too.
What's your opinion on apologetics, or the program of apologetics? Lewis, Chesterton, Craig, so to speak. Do you think advocating mere Christianity? Do you think that's a I think C.S. Lewis describes, I think he has a one paragraph describe it. Do you think there is a such thing as mere Christianity? Or do you have to be a Christian Calvinist or Christian Arminian or Christian Orthodox, or so to speak? Do you think there is do you think there's a value in just arguing general Christianity? Or do you think you should be arguing Christianity and type of Christianity you are? And that's my question.
Okay. As to the question, the last question you just asked. Okay, so are you familiar with the sort of square graph of knowledge that we get from Kant?
I probably have heard of it.
We have say two columns. The first column is a priori, the second column is a posteriori, and then we have two rows. The top row is analytic, and the bottom row is synthetic. So we get
that was in the Hoppe video as well. Hoppe
exactly. Okay, so while we do know that theoretically, and actually, a priori analytic, a priori synthetic, and a posteriori synthetic are all true. They are theoretically possible and actually true. Now we have in the one quadrant a posteriori analytic, which is theoretically possible but actually nonsense. I mean, actually, you just can't have that. We don't speak of a posteriori analytic truths. And I think in that sense, C.S. Lewis could be considered correct. Mere Christianity is a sort of postulate, fills a rounded out graph of possibilities. But I think in actual fact, it doesn't actually exist. Now, in the extent that it's helpful, though, is that in the same way that your math teacher, your history teacher will simplify the facts of the matter in order to not overwhelm the student with too much information, that might be useful as a pedagogical tool to not overwhelm the seeker with too much information.
Right. But so you think a general apologetic approach is a effective tool or ineffective tool? Do you think you run the risk of and are there positions, this might go in the next conversation we have, but are there positions within Christianity, so to speak, this might sound like a contradiction, but are there positions within Christianity that you think are inherently un-Christian, so to speak? Do you think something like, I don't know, Calvinism, double predestination?
Oh, you mean within the broader Christian vision?
Yeah.
Well, hold on. So aren't you cheating a little bit? Shouldn't this be for a future video?
Yeah, probably.
Why don't we put a bookmark on that question for the future video where it's ready?
All right. Well.
So is there anything else you wanted to cover for this first topic of knowledge and why Christianity?
No, not really. That's probably about it.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Tim. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast signing off.